Hey everybody, welcome to Becoming a Bible Nerd. Good morning. We are on chapter 22 of Acts. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and it's been one of my most favorite sections of Acts to study, so I'm really excited about this. And while everybody is logging on, I want to talk about this summer and what the plan is going to be. So we will wrap up Acts by the end of May. That's coming up. We are already on chapter 22. There's 28 chapters. And then we'll take like maybe 2 weeks off. And then this summer, I'm super excited to announce that we are going to go through Peter's letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. We have talked about how we're not going to see him for a long time through the rest of this book, and then most of the letters in the Old Testament are from Paul, so we really are going to lose track of Peter. So we're going to bring him to you this summer, and it's not going to just be me teaching. There's going to be 4 of us, so I'm really excited about that. Lessons will be 1 day a week on Thursdays, same time, and so anyway, that's exciting. In the fall, I'm still praying about what to do, but it's going to be more than likely one of Paul's letters. And in the spring, I'm looking at something in the Old Testament. So really exciting. I'm looking and seeing who's all on this morning. Good morning, everybody. Go ahead and turn to 22, but we are going to back up to the end of 21 because we didn't finish that. And I feel like these chapters went together. Like, it was weird to me that they separated them into 2 different chapters. So, at the end of 21, Paul had been told to go by the Jewish council to go into the temple, and with these 4 men, Jewish men, that were taking a vow, and while they were getting the priest to cut their hair, to pay their temple fee for that act of service, and that this was going to tell all of these Jews that have come into Jerusalem for the celebrations and the festivities. It was gonna show them that he is still true to his Jewish roots and to the Mosaic law. Early morning, my brain's not working. So, Paul purified himself, and he went into the temple complex. And some Jews from Asia saw him and stirred up the crowd. And this is what they said in 28. And I'm in chapter 21. In verse 28. Men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches everyone, everywhere, against our people, our law in this place. What's more, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and has profaned this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple complex. So this is what they're using to get everyone fired up. In fact, archaeologists have found, I'm looking for what notes say this. Archaeologists have found, when they're excavating parts of the temple, this, and I thought this was really cool, and this is in Constable's notes. These were in Latin and Greek, and it was plaques at the foot of the steps leading to the area into the temple. And this is what those plaques said: no man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame, that his death ensues. And so there were warnings, clear warnings throughout the temple that we have discovered today that said no man from another nation, a Gentile, is allowed to go into the temple. And so these lies spread, and anger and resentment grew. So they seized Paul and dragged him out of the complex, and it says in Scripture that they shut the gates at once. The reason that is in there is because their intent was to kill him, and there was going to be a lot of blood, and this blood would have defiled the temple. And so these men, these probably priests or people who work the temple, shut the doors quickly, like, oh, okay, they're about to kill him. We're not going to try to stop that. Let's just shut the doors so we don't defile this holy place. Just crazy. And then the commander of the Roman regiment hears about the chaos. And Dr. Constable says that Rome demanded civil order. We've seen this through our study. And a riot was unforgivable for the crowd and the commander who allowed it. And so this man, this Roman commander, knows he has to squash this, and he has to do it quick. His own life is in danger if he allows this to happen. So they take Paul to the barracks, and they had to carry him because he had been beaten so badly. So Paul is mistaken for the notorious freedom fighter, Messiah claimer, who had been there 3 years before and led rebels into killing Romans and pro-Roman Jews in the crowd. And Paul exclaimed, "I'm a Jew, I have a right to be in the temple, and I'm from Tarsus." And we're going to talk about why he said that in just a minute. And then he asked if he can address the crowd, and he gestures to quiet the crowd, and he speaks to them in their Hebrew language, Aramaic, to relate to them. So this is where we're picking up his actual speech to the Jewish crowd. Now, Luke writes, and he points out that he spoke to them in the Aramaic language. This would have been the common language among the Hebrew people living in Jerusalem during that day. Good morning, sunshine. It's going to be a while, okay? I'm a mom and my kids are up. You see him sometimes speaking Greek to people who are Greek, and now he's choosing to speak Aramaic, and he says later in Scripture, he becomes all things to all people. He knows how to mold himself to fit into whatever crowd he is in. And so he tells them basically that he's Jewish and he's from Tarsus. People were judged during this time by the importance of the place they were born. So this is important for him to tell people he was from Tarsus. Whenever he says this, it's not just like, I'm going to go around and say, well, I'm Carrie from Port Neches. People don't care, but in that day, that was social status. And Tarsus was a big deal because it was one of the 3 chief centers of learning in the ancient world. Do you know what the other 2 chief centers were? We've talked about these, where there was a lot of learning and talking about this. If y'all want to put that later, I'll tell you in just a minute if I remember. So he tells them that he was from Tarsus, this very extremely learned place and respected in this ancient world. He was brought to Jerusalem when he was young. He studied under Gamaliel. He's basically saying, I am one of you. He's zealous for God like you, and he even persecuted Christians, the followers of the way, and put them in jail, and traveled to Damascus, even follow him. And then he tells his Damascus story. So now we're going to back up. Tuesday, we talked about being a lighthouse to the world. And there were a couple of steps that I just kind of were guidelines on how to do this. And step 1 was to get our temple right. We needed to clean out the temple. There's things in our life that make us look like the world. And Jesus calls us to be holy. And that means to be set apart, to look different so that our flame can be bright, so others can see it and they can know the way. So we have to clean out the temple. We have to examine ourselves and figure out what's garbage and worldly and get it out. And then 2 was we have to get messy, where these Hebrew people thought that they had to separate themselves from the world. God is saying, no, I want you to get in the world and get messy and be amongst these people so that they can see the light. And we talked about that, and I told you I'd tell you step 3 today. And step 3 is when you're in the middle of all this, to share your story. So we're going to back up to Mark chapter 5, and we talked about this in Matthew quite a bit, and we're just going to kind of recap, or those of you that didn't go through Matthew. There is a season where Jesus gets in a boat and he goes across the Sea of Galilee into the Decapolis, and this is one of those 10 Roman occupied regions of Israel. And when he gets there, he is in kind of a burial ground, and this crazy demon-possessed man comes out, and he's shackled, and Jesus actually has a conversation with the demon that has control of him, and the demon recognizes him as the Most High, and Jesus commands this. It's not even really one demon. He says he's legion, he's many, and Jesus commands the legion out of the host, and he kind of gave them the option of where they wanted to go, and they chose these pigs, and so he sent them to the pigs, and the pigs ran out. And the man I'm just going to kind of pick up at the end of the story. In Mark chapter 5, it says that the people that kind of were the owners of this man, I guess, begged Jesus to leave. And as he was getting in the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed kept begging him to be with him, but he would not let him. Instead, this is what he told him: "Go back home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So he went and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much he had done, and they all were amazed. So, step 3, part 3 of what we need to do to be a light is to share our story. And we can learn a lot from Paul. We have seen him already through this whole journey in Acts as he becomes all things to all people. When he's in the synagogue, he's talking about the law of Moses, and he's pointing out prophecies that point to Jesus. Whenever he's in Athens among philosophers and people that have no idea what the Old Testament says, he quotes their own philosophers, and their own poems point to Jesus and this great creator. Time out, the chief centers in the ancient world of learning were Athens, Alexandria, which was in Egypt, and Tarsus. So anyway, Paul becomes all things to all people. So we can learn from Jesus and Paul this morning. Number 1, when we say share your story, your testimony, that doesn't always have to be exactly how you came to Jesus. Like, oh, when I was 7, this is what happened. Your story is ever changing, and you can take bits and pieces of your story that is applying to whatever the person that you're talking to is going through. For example, when I was 19, that's really when I became sold out for God, and I had that encounter with God that left me unchanged. I will share that story when people want to have that encounter with God. But other people might be going through a tragedy. Maybe their family member has cancer. Well, that's the part of my story that I share with that person. But this is what God tells us to do. Go back to Mark. It says, report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has shown mercy on you. So if you're talking to someone that's having marriage problems and you yourself have gone through that, tell them about how the Lord restored your marriage and the good things he's done. If you had some kind of substance abuse problem and you're talking to somebody who's struggling with the same thing, that's the part of the story you share. So you become all things to all people. You grab bits and pieces of your story that applies to what they've gone through, and you share the good news and what God has done through that. And so that is what Paul was doing. He was sharing his story. And to these people, it backfired, because he gets to the part that says that Jesus told him to go to the Gentiles. And I wrote in my Bible, fury rose within them. Now, Constable on 196, and I thought this was so interesting. Let's see where I'm at. It says, he said Jews had taken the message of God to the Gentiles for many times in the past. We read about the prophet Jonah, who was sent to Nineveh. Nineveh was a very godless place in the Old Testament, in a pagan world, and God sent him there, and when he disobeyed and didn't go there, well, you know the story. And so this is not something that's rare or hasn't ever been done before. Even Pharisees had traveled to Gentile territories to talk about Jesus, and in Matthew we see this. So Constable says that revelation could not have been what infuriated Paul's audience. What upset them was that Paul was approaching Gentiles directly about the Messiah without first introducing them to Judaism and its institutions. This was equivalent to placing Gentiles on the same footing before God as Jews, and this was the height of apostasy to the Jewish mind. So they were mad that he was saying that Jesus' blood can cover their sins too without them converting to Judaism, and that's what made them mad. I have somebody who wants to say good morning real quick.
Good morning.
You want to take her?
Do you
Okay.
like my puppy?
They love your puppy. Okay, you can take her in the other room. I'm going to finish, okay?
Okay.
Just keeping it real this morning. So lost my train of thought. So this fury rose within them because they believed that he was speaking blasphemy, that these Gentiles didn't have to convert to Judaism first. So let me get to where I am now. It says here in scripture that they wanted to wipe this person off of the earth. It's a disgrace for him to live. And then they ended up yelling and flinging aside their robes and throwing dust in the air. And in my study group, we all just laughed because it's like a big adult temper tantrum. But then the commander of the Roman brigade ordered him to be brought into the barracks, directing that they examine him with the scourge so that they could discover what in the world was going on. So, back to Constable. This scourge was like a whip with bones and metal in that would rip your skin from off of your bone. And they were going to beat him with this. And and so I'm sorry, I'm totally distracted now that Edie came in here. So they were going to beat him with this, and this is what Constable points out to us, that this is something that they did to Jesus as well. He says, in being called a witness to Jesus, Paul was also called to suffering. Suffering that increasingly looked like Jesus' suffering and includes an extensive series of trials and threats to Paul's life. The trials, even though extended over much more time and depicted in fuller scenes, resemble Jesus' trials. Both Jesus and Paul must appear before the Jewish council, the Roman governor, and a Jewish king, and both are repeatedly declared innocent, yet never released. So, I just wanted to sit here for a while. Paul was called to suffering. There's times, even in my Christian walk, that people have gone through things and they didn't like it and they blame God. Or they might even say, my God would never let me go through something like this. And scripture is very clear that sometimes we are called to suffering. Not that Jesus causes it. We live in a fallen world, but he allows it. And what I've discovered, that most people that do great things for the kingdom became servants through suffering. Bill Wilson is, he has the largest sidewalk Sunday school in the world. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and for decades he has bussed in kids every Saturday, hundreds of kids from all of the boroughs in New York, to do sidewalk Sunday school. But not only do they do that, they go out every week and do like a on-the-go sidewalk Sunday school in these different boroughs. And he has workers that are assigned to go visit the kids that come. They know these kids by name. They sponsor them. They give them Christmas presents. They go into their houses. They've gotten messy. They have walked in on parents that have died. He has gotten stabbed. He's gotten shot. And he's really traveled throughout the world fighting social injustice for kids. He's gone into places where there's sex trafficking and just bullied his way in to rescue kids. Really, there's nothing that stops him from rescuing kids around the world. And his story is that when he was just a child, I forget what age, but an older child, his mom just dropped him off on a street corner, and he stood there for 3 days until a gentleman finally picked him up and didn't know what to do with him, so he sent him to a youth camp. His childhood was full of suffering and sorrow, but it's what made him one of the greatest world changers of our modern day time. And our very own Alyssa Lyons, one of my study partners, is actually working for him right now. Rita Springer is a Christian songwriter, and I discovered her when I was in my early 20s, and her music just completely moved me. And then in the death of my mom, had it not been for her worship music, I don't think I would have made it through. But as I have grown to know her, not personally, but just more about her through the years, I've come to know that she lives in a great amount of physical and emotional pain. And these songs that she's written has been from the depths of her heart in the most agonizing times of her life, just true times of crying out to God. And it takes that kind of hurt and suffering to put that much passion into something that can move and affect people all over the world at different times of their life. Even that guy on the plane that I told you was questioning about, people that are good around the world that are worshiping other gods, or that, he was struggling with the thought of, are they really going to go to hell? We talked about him on Tuesday. One of the conversations I was having with him was whenever he first got married, he played golf way too much, and his wife was fiery, and whenever he came home, she was attacking him, and his response was, oh, okay, I'll work on that. And the story was, it was just funny that she didn't no, we're supposed to fight about this. And he's like, what's there to fight about? I'll work on it. And my husband, being a counselor, is like that. And but I was curious to, he didn't have counseling training, and it's like, how is that your personality, that you're just like, oh, okay, I'll work on it? And he ended up telling me a story of great disappointment. His brother was drafted right out of high school into the NBA, and was a famous athlete for 15 years. And out of college, he was drafted by the Chicago Bears and hurt himself in training camp. And it was just one injury after another that quickly ended his career. He never got to step foot on the field and play a game. And this great pain had caused him to examine his life. He had become angry. And anyway, his story was through this pain that he became the person he is today. And he's a middle school coach. And the whole time he was talking, you could just tell he loves these kids. And it wasn't about winning. And he didn't have, his philosophy on coaching, I could tell, was going to be one of these, that he's really going to do great things, and he's at a great school. And I asked him, what do you see yourself in 20 years? And he's like, I don't know. I want to affect these kids today. Wherever that takes me, I don't care. So, just selfless. And he was a godly man that loved his children, and he was, and his wife. But, I just wonder what would have happened if all of his dreams came true with the Chicago, did I say Bulls earlier? Bears. I wonder if he would have been so selfless and calm and godly. On a couple of days later, I had a conversation with one of my friends that has a brother that's a professional athlete, and she was just telling me that he's not the same person that she once knew, and not in a good way, but that fame and the money had changed him, and he became more selfish, where suffering and heartache tend to make us more selfless. C.S. Lewis had some things, and I'm wrapping up, and I know I'm going over, but I don't want to rush through the suffering, and we're just hitting the highlights of suffering. This could be a series that goes on for 6 weeks, but C.S. Lewis had a great couple of things to say. One of his quotes says, God whispers to us in our pleasure. Think about that. He whispers to us in our pleasure. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That is when we become dependent and desperate, is when we're in times of pain and our ears are ready to hear, and we search for him and we seek him and we spend more time with him. When life is great, it's like we're too busy. Oh God, I'll catch you tonight. I'm sorry, I got to go about my day. But when we are hurting, we're up in the middle of the night, we're up in the morning. It's like we cannot get enough. We are so desperate for him. Another thing C.S. Lewis says is hardships often prepare ordinary people for extraordinary destiny. A couple of books, if you're interested in this, to read. I've talked about before, Hind's Feet on High Places by Hannah Arendt. It's an allegory, so it's a fictional story. It's easy reading. If you want a little something deeper, C.S. Lewis and these quotes are from a book called The Problem of Pain, and it's how to reconcile suffering in this world when we have a sovereign God. And John Piper, who's a fabulous author, he has a book that I have not read, but I just came across in this study called Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. So those might be some books that you can to look into. But I wanted to close this morning, and we're really going to go over, but I wanted to share one last story of suffering with you about a man named Horatio Spafford. And one of my study partners mentioned for me to talk about this, and so I started looking into his life last night. And in 1870, he was a successful Chicago lawyer who was heavily invested in real estate. And in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed all of his investments. And that same year, he lost his 2-year-old son. His life work completely destroyed. 2 years later, he decided to go on a big European family vacation, and part of this trip was going to be to meet up with D.L. Moody, who was a famous evangelist of this time, and Horatio was a supporter of him, but because of the Chicago fire and his investment, something happened at the last second that made him stay. So he went ahead and sent his family over, his wife and his 4 girls, and he stayed back to take care of business and was going to meet him. And he gets a telegram from his wife that tells him that his 11-year-old little girl and his 9-year-old little girl and his 7-year-old little girl and his 2-year-old little girl sank on this ship. But his wife survived. So he went over to meet her and to stay and to heal with Dwight Moody. And during that time of healing, he wrote "It Is Well," that famous hymn that we sing today in church. But that's not where his story ends. In 1876, they had a little boy named Horatio II, and 2 years later, he died of scarlet fever. So in 1878, he gives birth to a little girl, and she later writes that it wasn't just the pain of losing all his daughters that just about killed him. It was compounded by a crisis of faith. Their church, you see, had told him that God was punishing them for sins in their life, and he didn't love them anymore. I just can't imagine. So in 1881, little Grace was born. And through their pain, he decided to take his family of 4 now and move to Jerusalem. He says, "Jerusalem is where my Lord lived, suffered, and conquered. And I wish to learn how to live, suffer, and especially conquer." I'm sorry. So he set up a children's home there. He started soup kitchens. He started hospitals and orphanages. See, Horatio was desperate to know more of God. He knew he couldn't survive without him. The suffering had caused him to move to the land where Jesus walked. And because of this, he gained trust from Muslims, he gained trust from Jewish people, and he gained trust from Christians. And he made a huge difference in this community. It just made me think of Matthew 5:6 on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, for they will be filled." You see, we don't even know. This is a hard analogy for us in America because we don't really know what hunger and thirst is, like where you're so desperate. The closest thing that we can get to is maybe during a hard workout in the middle of August if we're running 5 miles. You're just dying for thirst, and all you can think about is getting back to that water bottle. I don't even know what it's like to be so hungry that's all. It's just a complete desperation. But Jesus is saying when we get there, but usually we can only get that hungry and that desperate when we suffer. But we will be filled with righteousness and we can change a world. So if you are suffering today, if you have heartache in your life, just cling to the Lord. And I just want you to end today. I posted a song called "Hungry." It just made me think of this beatitude in Matthew. Just kind of worship him this morning. Take another minute or two, worship him. I'm sorry I went over. We are going to just catch chapter 23 on Tuesday. Happy reading. Have a great weekend.